somewhere over the English Channel, in the winter of 1942, a formation of RAF bombers is flying south toward occupied France. They cannot see the enemy, but the enemy can see them. A German radar dish is spinning on a cliff north of Le Havre, tracking range, altitude, bearing. It feeds that data to night fighters already climbing to intercept. Britain has no counter, because Britain does not understand the machine. So someone in London proposes something almost irrational. Land paratroopers in occupied France, at night, beside the radar, and steal it. Can 120 men grab Hitler's secret weapon and escape alive? To understand why 120 men were asked to parachute into occupied France for a single piece of equipment, you first need to understand what was killing them. By 1941, the air over Western Europe had changed. It was no longer just sky. It was a system. An invisible architecture of radio waves, antenna dishes, plotting tables, and men trained to read their glow. And inside that architecture, British bomber crews were dying at a rate that could not be sustained. It started with a radar the British did not expect. Germany, like Britain, had been developing radar since the mid-1930s. Both nations understood the basic principle. You emit a pulse of radio energy. When it strikes an object, part of that energy bounces back. Measure the time it takes to return, and you know how far away the object is. Measure the angle of return, and you know its bearing. It is simple physics. What made the difference was how each nation used it. Britain had its chain, home system. A string of tall radar towers along the southern and eastern coasts, built to spot incoming aircraft during daylight and provide enough warning to scramble fighters. It had worked. During the Battle of Britain, that system, crude as it was, had given the RAF the minutes it needed to get Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air. It helped save the country, but chain home was imprecise. It gave approximate direction and approximate range. It could not guide a fighter to a specific bomber in the dark. For night defense, it was not enough. And that gap, the gap between early warning and precision, was exactly the space where Germany built something terrifying. The Kammhuber Line was the name given by the Allies to the German night fighter air defense system established in Western Europe in July 1940 by Colonel Joseph Kammhuber. It consisted of a series of control sectors equipped with radars and searchlights and an associated night fighter. Picture Europe at night. From Denmark to the middle of France, the Germans erected a chain of overlapping zones, each one roughly 20 miles wide and 32 kilometers long. Each control center was known as a Himmelbett zone, consisting of a Freya radar with a range of about 100 kilometers, a master searchlight directed by the radar, and a number of manually directed searchlights spread through the cell. Each cell was also assigned one primary and one backup night fighter. The system had two eyes, and each eye did something different. The two systems complemented each other. Freya was a long-range early warning radar but lacked precision, and Würzburg had a much shorter range but was far more precise. The Freya picked up incoming bombers at great distance and alerted the system. Then the Würzburg locked on, not to one aircraft, to two. Ground controllers used two Würzburg radars, one for the bomber, one for the German fighter. On a plotting table below ground, operators watched two dots moving across a glass screen, one red and one blue, and they radioed heading corrections to the night fighter pilot until the blue dot merged with the red. Then the shooting started. The night fighter would close to within 2 miles, sometimes less, and use its own short-range airborne radar, the Liechtenstein, to make the final approach. The bomber crew would have no warning. No searchlight to signal danger, no flak to dodge, just a twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 rising from the darkness below, its cannons pointed upward, and then a stream of fire tearing through the fuselage. This was not a random system. It was not luck. It was engineering, and it worked with a quiet, lethal efficiency that turned every mission over France or Germany into a calculated gamble. In 1941, RAF bombers attacking targets in Germany and occupied Europe were suffering heavy losses from Luftwaffe night fighters. Royal Air Force losses increased to about 4% per raid, an unacceptable level. 4% does not sound like a number that ends a war, but it ends men. A 4% loss rate per sortie means that after 30 missions, the statistical probability of surviving a full tour is below 30%. And 30 missions was the standard tour for Bomber Command. The arithmetic was merciless. These were not the losses of a single catastrophic night. They were the losses of a system. Week after week, crew after crew, Lancasters and Halifaxes and Wellingtons taking off from English airfields in the early dark, flying south, crossing the coast, and entering the invisible cells of the Kammhuber line. Some returned, some did not. And the ones who did not were not victims of accident or weather. They were victims of precision. The Würzburg was the instrument of that precision. The low UHF band Würzburg radar was the primary ground-based tracking radar for the Wehrmacht's Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine during World War II. It was not enormous. It was not exotic. Würzburg used a 3-metre paraboloid dish antenna, which could be folded along the horizontal midline for travel on a wheeled trailer. It looked like a large metal bowl, gray-green, mounted on a pedestal, rotating slowly in the Atlantic wind. The Telefunken team developed an accurate system based on a Klystron microwave tube operating in the range of 54 to 53 centimeters, with a maximum range of about 29 kilometers and accuracy to about 25 meters in range. 25 meters. That is not a vague indication. That is a kill zone. And there were thousands of them. Eventually, over 4,000 Würzburgs of various models were produced. They sat along the Atlantic Wall, in fields behind the French coast, on hilltops in Belgium and the Netherlands, around the perimeter of the Ruhr, surrounding Berlin. Each one was paired with a Freya. Each pair fed a Himmelbett box. Each box had its own night fighter orbiting in the dark, waiting for the word. The Kammhuber line was not a wall you could see. It was not barbed wire. It was a wall made of knowledge, and it was invisible, and it killed at a distance, and RAF Bomber Command was bleeding into it. The problem was not just the casualties. The problem was the trajectory. Night fighter engagements under the Kammhuber line framework contributed to loss rates exceeding 4 to 5% per major raid in early 1943, levels deemed unsustainable for prolonged campaigns. Bomber Command could not grow fast enough to replace its dead. Crews were being trained, shipped to squadrons, and killed before they completed half their tours. Every month, the mathematics grew worse. Every month, the Kammhuber line grew longer. More boxes, more Würzburgs, more night fighters, and the men inside the bombers knew it. They did not know the name Kammhuber. They did not know what a Himmelbett box was. They knew that when they crossed the coast, something changed. They felt it the way a man in water feels the current shift. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, someone was pointing, and then, if they were unlucky, the sky lit up from the inside. The crews developed their own language for it. They called it the darkness that sees. There was no bluster in this language. There was no defiance. These were men who understood, with the particular clarity of those who are being hunted, that the sky had been turned into a system designed to find them and kill them, and they had no reply. Britain did not yet understand the Würzburg, not its frequency, not its precision, not its method of tracking. What the RAF knew was that something new had appeared on the French coast, something beyond the Freya, and wherever it appeared, more bombers died. You cannot jam a signal you have not measured. You cannot deceive a system you have not mapped, and you cannot fight what you do not understand. That understanding, in the winter of 1941, was the most valuable commodity in the WWII British war effort, more valuable than a squadron of Spitfires, more valuable than a shipload of fuel, because without it, the bombers would keep dying, and without the bombers, Britain had no way to hit back. The Würzburg sat on a cliff in occupied France, spinning slowly, watching, and no one in Britain knew how to stop it. Subscribe if you want more hidden WWII histories told carefully. Inside a nondescript set of buildings at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, scattered across the English countryside near Swanage on the Dorset coast, a small group of scientists was trying to solve a problem that was, in the most literal sense, invisible. They knew the Germans had radar. That much had been clear since before the war. They knew about Freya, the long-range early warning set, and they had even begun developing countermeasures for it. But by late 1941, something else had appeared, something sharper, something that was not Freya. By the end of 1941, it became apparent that the Germans had developed something more effective than the Freya, for German flak and night fighter defense had markedly improved. Wellington bombers fitted with receivers had picked up radio emissions from France that did not match the known signatures of the Freya system. The frequency was different. The pulse pattern was different. The signal was tighter, more concentrated, and seemed to be coming from shorter range. This was not an early warning radar. This was something designed to track individual aircraft with an accuracy that Britain had not anticipated. Bomber losses on each raid began to increase during 1941, which British intelligence concluded was due to German use of advanced radar equipment. The British and Germans had been competing in radar technology for nearly a decade at this point, with the German technology often at the same level as the British or surpassing them due to heavy investment in the fledgling technology. The man at the center of the puzzle was a 30-year-old physicist named Reginald Victor Jones. R.V. Jones was a British physicist and scientific military intelligence expert who played an important role in the defense of Britain in World War II by solving scientific and technical problems. He was not a soldier. He was not a commander. He was a scientist who had been pulled into the intelligence world almost by accident, and who had found that the analytical methods of physics applied with startling efficiency to the problems of war. Jones had been appointed in 1939 as Britain's first scientific intelligence officer and had spent the first years of the conflict researching how advanced German radar was. His office was not glamorous. His tools were photographs, intercepted signals, fragments of captured equipment, and the occasional decrypt from Bletchley Park. His method was deduction. He would take a small piece of evidence, a photograph showing a new antenna shape, a frequency reading from an electronic receiver, a scrap of conversation intercepted from a Luftwaffe ground controller, and then he would sit in the quiet of his cluttered room and think. By the winter of 1941, the evidence was accumulating, and it was not encouraging. It was realized that German night fighters were being guided from the ground by two linked radar systems, codenamed Freya and Würzburg. Jones and the Boffins at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Swanage identified these as key elements in the so-called Kammhuber line, a network of guidance stations that enabled the Luftwaffe to inflict punitive losses on RAF Bomber Command. Jones understood the architecture of the German system. He could map the cells. He could predict where the night fighters would orbit. But the critical gap was the Würzburg itself. He did not know its exact operating frequency. He did not know the bandwidth of its receiver. He did not know whether it used a simple pulse system or something more sophisticated, like conical scanning, which would make it far harder to jam. He did not know its vulnerabilities, because he had never seen one. Speculation was not enough. The TRE scientists could theorize about frequencies and pulse widths and antenna patterns, and they did, endlessly. But theory without data is guesswork dressed in mathematics. And guesswork does not save bombers. The intelligence picture was fragmentary and frustrating. Aerial photographs from RAF reconnaissance flights showed small dish-shaped objects at various points along the French coast, but the photographs could not reveal what was inside the electronics cabinet at the base of the dish. Intercepted signals gave rough frequency ranges, but without knowing the precise characteristics of the transmitter and receiver, the scientists could not design a jammer that would reliably confuse the set. And they could not simply tune a jammer to a broad range of frequencies and hope for the best. Broad-spectrum jamming required enormous power and many transmitters. Targeted jamming required knowledge. The knowledge did not exist. There was a further complication. If Britain deployed a countermeasure prematurely, based on incomplete understanding, and that countermeasure failed, the Germans would immediately recognize the attempt and adapt. They would change frequencies. They would add filters. They would harden the system. And the window of opportunity for an effective counterstrike would close, possibly for good. To neutralize the Würzburg system by developing countermeasures against it, Jones and his team needed to study one of the systems, or at least the more vital pieces of technology of which the system was composed. This was the intelligence gap. Not a gap of courage or willpower, but a gap of physical evidence. The most dangerous radar in Europe was sitting on cliffs and hilltops a few dozen miles across the English Channel, and the men who needed to defeat it could not touch it, could not measure it, could not open it up and look inside. The frustration in Jones's circle was specific and technical, but its consequences were vast and human. Every week that passed without understanding the Würzburg was another week of 4% losses, another week of young men climbing into bombers and not coming back, another week in which the Kammhuber line grew longer and more deadly. Jones needed a Würzburg, not a photograph of one, not a signal intercepted at range. He needed the machine itself, or at least the critical components, the transmitter, the receiver, the pulse modulator, the parts that would tell him exactly what this machine could do, and exactly where it could be broken. And the only place to get those parts was across the Channel, in occupied France, behind the Atlantic Wall, guarded by the Wehrmacht. The gap between what the scientists knew and what they needed was 20 miles of cold water and an army of occupation. And it was widening with every passing night. The proposal, when it was finally articulated, had the quality of all truly dangerous ideas. It was simple, it was logical, and it sounded insane. If the scientists could not understand the Würzburg from a distance, then someone would have to go to the Würzburg. Not fly over it, not photograph it. Go to it, stand beside it, open it, take the pieces out, and bring them home. The idea did not emerge from a single meeting or a single mind. It grew from the accumulating desperation of the intelligence community, from the nightly losses over France, from the quiet conversations between scientists and military planners who understood that the air war was being lost at the level of electronics, and that the only way to win it back was to steal the enemy's most carefully guarded secret. Jones was instrumental in convincing the British High Command to authorize a raid to capture the radar system. The request moved through channels. It reached the desk of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. To achieve this goal, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, the recently appointed head of Combined Operations, proposed a raid into occupied France to capture a new German radar set. Mountbatten was a complicated figure, aristocratic, ambitious, charismatic, and possessed of a restless energy that made him both effective and controversial. He had taken command of Combined Operations Headquarters in October 1941, replacing Roger Keyes, and his mandate was to plan and execute raids against German-held territory. Raids that would gather intelligence. Raids that would keep the enemy off balance. Raids that would prove to the British public and to Britain's allies that the fight was not static, that something was happening, that someone was hitting back. The Bruneval target appealed to him. It was bold. It was specific. It had a clear strategic purpose, and it was exactly the kind of operation that could demonstrate the value of combined operations, using paratroops, infantry, navy, and air force in a single coordinated strike. But not everyone was enthusiastic. Initial reaction to the proposal was disappointing. Although Air Marshal Henry Portal, the Chief of the Royal Air Force, expressed interest, neither the Royal Navy nor the British Army were excited by the proposal, as it was felt that the benefit would mostly fall to the Royal Air Force. There were legitimate concerns. A raid into occupied France was not a simple matter. The French coast was fortified. German garrisons were stationed at every significant point. Any landing force would be immediately detected, and reinforcements could arrive within an hour, perhaps less. The window of time for any operation would be measured in minutes, not hours. And if the raid failed, if the men were killed or captured and the equipment destroyed, the intelligence loss would be zero and the political damage severe. However, when the proposal reached the ears of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who favored it, things changed. Churchill understood the strategic calculus. He understood that the bomber offensive was the only weapon Britain could bring against the German homeland, and that anything which improved the survival rate of bombers was worth extraordinary risk. He gave his approval. Mountbatten's planners now faced the operational question. How do you assault a radar station on a cliff in occupied France, dismantle it under fire, and evacuate before the enemy seals the area? The first option considered was a seaborne commando raid. Approach from the sea, scale the cliffs, attack the installation, and withdraw by boat. It had a certain directness, but the Bruneval site was well defended from the seaside. Mountbatten and his staff studied the Bruneval installation and its defenses, rapidly concluding that due to the extensive coastal defenses in the area, it was too well guarded to permit a seaborne commando raid. They considered that such a raid would result in high casualties among the attacking troops and would not be fast enough to capture the Würzburg radar before it was destroyed by the Germans. That last point was critical. Speed was not a luxury. It was the heart of the mission. The Germans knew the Würzburg was valuable. They would have orders to destroy it rather than let it be captured. If a seaborne raid took 30 or 40 minutes just to get men to the installation, the defenders would have more than enough time to smash the equipment, burn the documents, and render the entire operation meaningless. Believing that surprise and speed were to be the essential requirements of any raid against the installation to ensure the radar was captured, Mountbatten saw an airborne assault as the only viable method. Paratroopers. Drop them from the sky, directly beside the radar. They would be on the ground in minutes. The enemy would have no warning. The strike team could reach the Würzburg before the defenders had time to destroy it. And then, having taken what they needed, the paratroopers would fight their way down to the beach and evacuate by sea. It was a plan that required everything to work. The drop had to be accurate. The assault had to be fast. The dismantling had to be precise. The withdrawal had to be timed to the minute. The Navy had to be waiting in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And the entire operation had to be completed before German reinforcements arrived in force. On the 8th of January 1942, Mountbatten contacted the headquarters of the 1st Airborne Division and 38 Wing RAF, asking if they were able to conduct the raid. The division's commander, Major General Frederick Browning, was particularly enthusiastic, as a successful operation would be an excellent morale boost to the airborne troops. Britain's parachute forces were new, untested, and hungry for a chance to prove their worth. They had trained and trained and trained, but they had never been used in a significant operation. Browning saw Bruneval as their proving ground. The machinery began to turn. Planners studied maps. Intelligence officers pored over photographs. Naval commanders calculated tides. And somewhere in the system, a request was made for one specific man. A man who understood radar. A man who could be dropped behind enemy lines, walk up to the most dangerous piece of electronics in the German arsenal, and take it apart with his hands. The operation received its code name, Biting. And the clock, which would not stop ticking until the last man was pulled off that beach, had already begun. The target had been spotted months before the raid was approved. The station was situated on a clifftop 12 miles north of Le Havre and had been recently spotted on the 5th of December 1941 by a Spitfire of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, flown by Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill. Hill had pushed his unarmed, souped-up Spitfire across the channel at high altitude, flying a reconnaissance route over the French coast. His cameras, mounted in the belly of the aircraft, captured a series of high-resolution photographs that, when developed and analyzed back in England, revealed something unmistakable. A dish. A 3-metre parabolic reflector, sitting in a low enclosure on the edge of a cliff, pointed across the water toward England. Just behind it stood a large villa, a Victorian structure the British would come to call the Manor of the Cliff. Surrounding it were fields, hedgerows, and a scattering of defensive positions. The photographs told the planners almost everything they needed about the geography. The Würzburg sat on exposed ground, accessible from inland. Below the cliff, a ravine led down to a small beach. Vital intelligence on the guards and defenses of the site was provided by the French resistance. Crucially, they were able to confirm that the nearby beach had not been mined. This detail, the unmined beach, was the hinge on which the entire plan swung. Without a clear evacuation route, the operation was a suicide mission. With it, the mission became dangerous but possible. The French resistance network that provided this intelligence was the Confrérie Notre-Dame, led by Gilbert Renault, known by his code name Rémy. Two men traveled through rings of German security to Bruneval to get the local intelligence. These were Roger Dumont and Charles Chauveau, civilians who walked among the enemy, observing troop movements, counting sentries, timing patrols, and reporting back through clandestine channels. Their work was silent. Their risk was total. If caught, they would not be treated as prisoners of war. They would be interrogated and killed. a member of the French resistance movement who had participated in the previous reconnaissance in Bruneval, was subsequently captured and executed by the Germans. The intelligence picture assembled from aerial photographs and resistance reports revealed the following. A platoon of German infantry was stationed to the south in Bruneval and was responsible for manning the defenses guarding the evacuation beach, including a strong point near the beach, as well as pillboxes and machine gun nests on the top of the cliff overlooking the beach. The beach was not landmined and had only sporadic barbed wire defenses, but it was patrolled regularly. A mobile reserve of infantry was believed to be available at 1 hour's notice and stationed some distance inland. 1 hour. That was the margin. From the moment the first shot was fired, the raiders had approximately 60 minutes before German reinforcements arrived in strength. 60 minutes to assault the radar site, dismantle the equipment, fight their way to the beach, and get into the boats. The unit chosen for the operation was C Company of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Brigade. C Company was commanded by Major John Frost and comprised 120 men. Frost was 30 years old. A career soldier, he had served in Iraq and the Middle East before volunteering for the newly formed airborne forces. He was quiet, determined, and possessed of a particular temperament suited to operations where improvisation was not a plan but a certainty. He would later become one of the most famous British officers of the war, for reasons that had not yet happened. But in February 1942, he was an untested parachute officer preparing for his first combat jump. Based on the intelligence, Frost decided to divide the company into 5 groups of 40 men for the raid, each named after a famous Royal Navy admiral: Nelson, Jellicoe, Hardy, Drake, and Rodney. Each group had a specific task. Nelson would clear and secure German positions defending the evacuation beach, while Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake would capture the radar site, the villa, and the enclosure. Rodney would provide perimeter defense and hold the area against counterattack while the dismantling took place. But the most critical member of the entire raiding force was not a paratrooper. He was an RAF technician. The raiding force of about 120 men also included 10 Royal Engineers to help dismantle the equipment, and an RAF radar technician, Flight Sergeant Cox. Charles William Hall Cox was born on the 3rd of September 1913 in Cambridgeshire. He joined the Royal Air Force and became a specialist in the newly invented radar and served in coastal units during the Battle of Britain. Cox had not volunteered for the mission, not in the traditional sense. He was summoned to the Air Ministry on the 1st of February 1942 and met Air Commodore Victor Tate, Director of Radar, who told Cox he had volunteered for a dangerous mission, to which a surprised Cox replied he had not. However, Tate persuaded him that he had actually volunteered. There was a grim footnote to Cox's assignment that he did not learn until much later. It was considered of paramount importance that Cox not fall into enemy hands, and he was given a bodyguard for the operation. Little did Cox know that the bodyguard was actually there to kill Cox in the event of capture. So secret was a radar specialist's knowledge. Professor Jones attempted to protect Cox should he be captured by allowing him to wear Army uniform, but the Army refused, and Cox parachuted into occupied France in his RAF blue uniform, complete with shirt and tie, under his parachutist's smock. Cox had never jumped out of an aircraft. He was given a crash course in parachuting, a few weeks of training with C Company, and a detailed briefing on what to look for inside the Würzburg. Cox was tasked with the critical job of identifying and removing the parts which were essential to understanding how the radar worked, a task that would normally take hours of methodical work, but he was expected to complete in minutes while under heavy German fire. Training for the raid was intense. The parachute exercises followed one another for several weeks, day and night, at all altitudes, in good weather and in abundant rain. The coordination measures, particularly important in a combined action of this kind, were elaborated with the greatest care and detail. A final exercise was carried out on the 23rd of February 1942, 4 days before the planned start of the raid. It was a failure, as the vessels to re-embark Major Frost's commandos ran aground on sandbanks, and their crews could not bring them closer together. The final rehearsal had failed. The boats had run aground. The coordination between airborne and naval elements had broken down. 4 days before the real operation. There was no time to run it again. The weather window was closing. The tides were right for only a narrow span of days. The moon had to be bright enough for the pilots to find the drop zone, but the light had to fade before dawn to give the raiders darkness for their withdrawal. The plan went forward anyway. It went forward because there was no alternative, because the bombers were still dying, because the Würzburg was still spinning, and because sometimes the only rehearsal that matters is the one that counts. The evening of the 27th of February, 1942, was cold and clear over southern England. On the night of February 27th to 28th, the operation commenced as a fleet of Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bombers, modified for paratroop deployment, took off from RAF Thruxton, carrying the raiding party. The Whitley was not a glamorous aircraft. It was slow, ungainly, heavy-bellied, and known among its crews for being miserably cold at altitude. The paratroop conversion was crude. The men jumped through a hole cut in the floor of the fuselage, dropping into the slipstream and falling until the static line jerked their canopies open. There were no doors, no ramps, just a hole in the dark and the wind. 12 Whitleys, 120 men. Each aircraft carried approximately 10 paratroopers, their weapons, their ammunition, and the specially designed trolleys that Cox and the engineers would use to carry the dismantled radar components. Squadron leader Percy Pickard, commanding officer of No. 51 Squadron RAF, led the formation. On the night of the 27th to 28th of February, Pickard's squadron of Whitleys dropped C Company near a German Würzburg radar site at Bruneval, near Le Havre, in northern France. The aircraft climbed out over the English coast and turned south, crossing the Channel at medium altitude. The night was bright. The moon was nearly full, throwing a cold white light across the water and the thin cloud below. The pilots could see the French coast ahead, a dark line rising from the silver of the sea. Anti-aircraft fire sparked the air below and around them as they flew into French airspace. The flak was scattered but real. Tracers rose from the coast in lazy arcs, the light climbing toward the aircraft and then falling away. The pilots held their course. They had been briefed on the exact location of the drop zone, a set of fields south of the radar installation, and they flew to it with the concentration of men who knew that a navigation error of a few hundred yards could put their passengers on the wrong side of a cliff. At approximately midnight, the order was given. The hole was open. The wind was howling through the fuselage. The men sat on either side of the gap in the floor, their static lines hooked to the overhead cable, and waited. Then they went. Just after midnight on February 28th, 120 men dropped into the snow-covered fields surrounding the village of Bruneval in France. The snow was a surprise. It lay thin and bright across the fields, and the paratroopers came down into it with the particular silence of men under canopy, their chutes dark against the moon. The parachutes had been dyed in dark green and blue fabric to reduce their visibility. But against the snow, nothing was truly invisible. Frost landed well. He came down in roughly the right area, gathered his lines, collapsed his canopy, and looked around. The landmarks were in the dark, even in the snow, even within the dark, even in the snow, even with his heart pounding. But not everyone was so fortunate. The parachute drop from Whitley bombers was successful, apart from half of the party assigned to take and hold the beach being dropped a mile and a half away from its intended dropping point. The Nelson Group, the men whose job it was to clear the beach defenses, the machine guns, the pillboxes, the strong points that guarded the evacuation route. Half of them were on the ground a mile and a half from where they needed to be, in the dark, in enemy territory, with no radio contact and no way of knowing what was happening at the radar site. This was the first failure of the night, and it would nearly be fatal. But Frost did not know it yet. His radio sets, the equipment that was supposed to connect all 5 groups in a coordinated assault, were not working. The radio sets the force had been issued failed to work, giving him no means of communication with his other detachments. 120 men scattered across a frozen landscape in occupied France, with no communications, half the beach-clearing force in the wrong place, and a radar installation less than 1,000 yards away that was still spinning, still watching, still feeding data to the night fighters. The clock was running. Frost gathered the men he could find. The Hardy, Jellicoe, and Drake groups had landed close to their designated zones. They formed up quickly, silently, in the snow. Weapons were checked. Magazines were loaded. Bayonets were fixed. And then they moved. The approach to the radar site was made in near total silence. The paratroopers advanced across the open fields toward the villa and the Würzburg enclosure, their boots crunching softly in the thin snow. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows. The only sounds were the wind and the distant murmur of the sea against the cliffs. No one had raised the alarm. Not yet. The German garrison, the small infantry platoon in Bruneval village, the sentries at the radar station, were unaware that 100 men were moving toward them through the winter dark. The silence was about to end. The first shots came fast. The Hardy group reached the perimeter of the radar enclosure and found a single sentry. There was no time for subtlety. The paratroopers engaged. Gunfire broke the silence, and in that instant, the entire timetable of the operation collapsed into the brutal arithmetic of combat. Every second now mattered twice, because the shots that killed the sentry also woke the garrison. The assault unfolded in overlapping actions. Jellicoe moved on the villa. Drake moved to seal the approaches from the south. Hardy pushed into the enclosure where the Würzburg sat, its dish still pointed out across the channel, its electronics still humming in the cold. The raiding party encountered immediate resistance from German troops stationed at the radar site. A fierce firefight ensued, but the airborne troops, utilizing their training, aggressive fighting spirit, and superior tactics, managed to overcome the defenders. The German garrison at the radar station was not large. Small number of Luftwaffe technicians and a handful of infantry guards. They were surprised, outgunned, and facing paratroopers who had been training for this single moment for weeks. But they fought. They fought because they were soldiers, and because the Würzburg was their responsibility, and because the first instinct of any defender is to hold what they have been told to hold. The villa was taken quickly. The enclosure fell soon after, but the firefight was not yet over. The defenders, alerted by the first shots, moved toward the villa and responded in turn. One of the English commandos was killed during the exchanges of fire. For Major Frost, the situation deteriorated all the more as his men detected enemy vehicles heading toward the villa from the woods to the south. German reinforcements were already moving, and Frost had no radio. He could not reach the Nelson group to ask whether the beach was clear. He could not coordinate the withdrawal. He could not call for the Navy. He was fighting a battle in the dark, with only the men he could see and the orders he had given before the first shot was fired. But the mission was not the battle. The mission was the radar. Flight Sergeant Cox and several sappers arrived at the Würzburg and proceeded to dismantle the radar equipment, placing the pieces on specially designed trolleys. Cox had reached the Würzburg. He stood before it in the moonlight, the 3-metre dish looming over him, the electronics cabinet at its base still warm, still powered. Around him, the firefight continued. Bullets cracked through the air. Tracers arced over the enclosure. The sappers crouched beside him, tools in hand, waiting for his instructions. He had trained for this. He had studied British radar systems, been briefed by Jones's team on what to look for, and been given a priority list of components. The transmitter, the receiver, the pulse modulator, the antenna feed mechanism. These were the pieces that would reveal the Würzburg's secrets. These were the parts that the scientists back in England were desperate to examine. But Cox had never seen a Würzburg before. No British scientist had. He was working blind, in the dark, under fire, on a machine he had never touched, trying to identify the critical components by their shape, their position, their function, and then remove them without destroying them, in minutes instead of hours. He went to work. The sappers had brought hacksaws, spanners, screwdrivers, and crowbars. Cox directed them with a calm that surprised even himself. He identified the transmitter assembly. He identified the receiver. He found the pulse unit. The sappers cut, unscrewed, pried, and pulled. The components came free piece by piece, each one placed carefully on the waiting trolleys. Cox, the raid's technical expert, successfully dismantled key parts of the Würzburg apparatus. These parts included the receiver unit and the parabolic dish's control panel. There was one more thing the raiders were ordered to obtain, if possible: a prisoner. Specifically, a German radar operator who could explain how the components fitted together, what settings were used, what the machine could and could not do. The paratroops captured the site in a short firefight and took 2 prisoners, one of whom was a Würzburg operator. The capture of a trained operator was not incidental. It was, in its way, as valuable as the hardware. A machine tells you what it can do. An operator tells you how it is used. The difference is the difference between understanding a weapon and understanding a system. The Würzburg components were loaded onto the trolleys. The German prisoners were secured. Cox looked at the machine one last time. The dish was still standing, but its guts were gone. The electronics that had tracked RAF bombers for months, that had fed data to night fighters, that had helped kill men whose names Cox would never know, were now sitting in canvas bags and wooden crates on wheeled trolleys, ready to be dragged down a cliff to the sea. The firefight around the villa was intensifying. German vehicles were visible in the tree line to the south. Headlights flickered through the woods. The 1-hour window was closing. Having secured the radar equipment and under heavy enemy fire, Frost gave the order for the 3 detachments to withdraw to the evacuation beach. The assault phase was over. The dismantling was complete. The prisoners were taken. Now came the part of the plan that had no margin for error. They had to get off the cliff. They had to get to the beach. and the beach, for all they knew, was still in German hands. Position, providing covering fire while the trolleys were maneuvered toward the cliff path. The trolleys were heavy. The ground was uneven. The snow was thin but slippery, and the slope down toward the ravine was steep and exposed. Behind them, the sound of engines grew louder. The German reinforcements from inland were converging. They were not yet in contact, but they were close and closing. Every minute of delay on the cliff top was a minute of advantage surrendered. And below, the beach was still silent. It became apparent that the beach had not been secured by the understrength Nelson detachment when a German machine gun opened fire on the airborne troops, severely wounding the company sergeant major. The Nelson Group, the men designated to clear the beach defenses, was supposed to have taken the pillboxes and machine gun positions before the main force arrived. But half of the Nelson Group had been dropped 1.5 miles from the correct zone. They were still struggling through the countryside, disoriented, trying to reach the beach on foot. The remaining elements of Nelson had reached the beach, but they were too few. They had not been able to suppress all the German positions. At least one machine gun was still active, covering the beach with fire, and the paratroopers coming down the cliff were walking straight into it. Men pressed themselves into the rocky slope. The trolleys were manhandled over rough terrain. The wounded were carried. And all the while, the German machine gun chattered from the darkness ahead, and the sound of vehicle engines growled from the darkness behind. Frost was caught between two fires. If he stayed on the cliff, the reinforcements would pin him. If he pushed to the beach, the machine gun would cut his men apart, and the Navy was somewhere out there in the dark, waiting for a signal. Then the missing elements of the Nelson Group arrived. The raiders withdrew to the beach, where they were held up by a German machine gun position until the missing party arrived and helped suppress it. The second half of Nelson had made it. They came in from the flanks, disoriented but determined, and their added firepower was enough to silence the machine gun position. The beach was not clear, not perfectly, but it was clear enough. The paratroopers spilled down the cliff path and onto the shingle. The trolleys came with them, bumping and clattering over rocks. The wounded were laid out on the stones. The German prisoners were kept under guard. And Frost looked out at the black water of the channel, searching for the boats. They were not visible. The Navy had been given a rendezvous time and a signal. The signal was a green flare. Frost fired one, nothing happened. Out at sea, the naval force had its own problems. On the return journey, Frost learned that the naval force had received no signals apart from the signal flare, and had spent much of the time hiding from a German naval patrol that had nearly discovered them. The landing craft and motor gunboats had crossed the channel from England, arriving off the French coast in time for the extraction. But a German naval patrol had passed close to their position, and the British vessels had been forced to go dark and silent, drifting with engines cut, hoping not to be spotted. The patrol passed, but it cost time, precious time. Time during which 100 men were pinned on a narrow beach between a cliff and the sea, with German reinforcements tightening the perimeter above them. The flare arced over the water, and then, slowly, the shapes of the landing craft appeared in the darkness offshore. Small, flat-bottomed vessels, their engines running low, nosing toward the beach. The relief was not expressed. Relief is a private thing, and these men were still under fire. But the sight of those boats, emerging from the dark like something summoned by will alone, was the difference between capture and escape, between mission failure and mission success, between life and the absence of it. The boats came in. and the race to load began. The evacuation was not orderly. It was never going to be orderly. The beach was narrow, the surf was rough, and German fire was still coming from the clifftop. Men waded into the freezing water, hauling equipment and wounded comrades. The trolleys were lifted and passed hand over hand into the landing craft. The German prisoners were bundled aboard. Cox, still carrying his tool bag, climbed into a boat with the radar components he had stripped from the Würzburg less than an hour earlier. The successful mission concluded with a disorderly evacuation into 6 landing craft under heavy fire. 6 landing craft. Flat-bottomed, open-topped, designed for short-range amphibious work. They were not armored. They were not fast. They offered almost no protection against the bullets that were now striking the water around them. The men crouched low, pressed against the sides, holding the wounded steady as the boats backed off the beach and turned into the open channel. However, the radar, equipment, German prisoners, and all but 6 of the raiding force were embarked and transferred to motor gunboats for transport back to Britain. All but 6. The paratroopers lost 2 killed, 8 wounded, and 6 men who did not return to the boats. They were later taken prisoner by the Germans. 6 men left on the beach. 6 men who could not reach the boats in time, or who were cut off, or who were too badly wounded to move. They were captured. They would spend the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. Their names would be recorded, their fates known. But in the immediacy of that night, on a dark beach in France, they were simply gone. 2 killed. 2 men who had been alive at Thruxton Aerodrome 6 hours earlier, who had checked their parachutes and their weapons and climbed into the belly of a Whitley, and who now lay in the snow or on the shingle still. The cost was not negligible. The cost is never negligible when it is paid in men. But the boats were moving. The landing craft transferred their passengers to the waiting motor gunboats, which were faster and better suited for the channel crossing. The journey back to Britain was uneventful, with the force being escorted by 4 destroyers and a flight of Spitfires. As dawn broke over the English Channel, the motor gunboats and their escorts headed north. The Spitfires appeared overhead, circling in the gray morning light, a protective screen against any Luftwaffe attempt to intercept. None came. The German Air Force, alerted too late, did not find the convoy. Frost stood on the deck as the English coast came into view. He was cold, exhausted, and carrying the weight of command, the weight of knowing what had worked and what had not, what had been planned and what had gone wrong. The beach had almost been a disaster. The radios had failed. The Nelson Group had been scattered. The evacuation had been chaotic. But in the hold below his feet, wrapped in canvas and secured in crates, were the pieces of a Würzburg radar, the transmitter, the receiver, the pulse modulator, the antenna feed. The components that R.V. Jones and the scientists at TRE had been desperate to examine. And in the cabin behind him, under guard, sat a German radar operator who knew how to use them. Less than 3 hours after they had jumped, they scrambled down the cliffs to escape with a captured German radar and 2 prisoner-of-war technicians, having lost only a handful of men. Operation Biting, the Bruneval raid on the 27th and 28th of February 1942, was the first successful action by British paratroopers. The first. Not a rehearsal, not a demonstration. A real operation in enemy territory, under fire, with a clear objective achieved. The paratroopers had proven their concept. The combined operations model had worked. The intelligence community had its prize. But the true value of the raid would not be measured on the beach. or in the medals, or in the newspaper headlines that followed. It would be measured in a laboratory, in the quiet rooms where men in white coats would open the crates and begin to learn what the Würzburg really was. The stolen machine was on its way home, and the answers it carried were about to change the air war. The crates arrived at the telecommunications research establishment within days. Scientists gathered around the components with the focused intensity of surgeons opening a patient for the first time. They knew the rough shape of the problem. They had theorized for months about the Würzburg's capabilities. Now they had the machine itself, or at least its essential organs, laid out on workbenches under bright lights, and every assumption they had made was about to be tested. The first thing they examined was the transmitter. The raid provided the British with detailed specifications on the radar's 560 MHz operating frequency, parabolic dish design, and detection range of up to 35 kilometers, enabling subsequent analysis and development of targeted jamming techniques. 560 MHz. That was the number. That single frequency, now confirmed by physical hardware rather than intercepted signals, was the key that unlocked the entire countermeasures program. Because once you know the exact frequency of an enemy radar, you can design a jammer tuned precisely to that frequency. You can calculate the length of metal foil that will resonate at that wavelength. You can build a filter that will block that signal while letting your own signals through. The receiver was examined next. And here, the scientists found something they had not expected. It was not sophisticated. It was well-engineered, reliable, and effective within its design parameters. But it was not significantly more advanced than British equipment of the same period. The technological information provided by the equipment retrieved by Flight Sergeant Cox and by the interrogation of a German technician made it possible to reassure British scientists that their adversaries were not as technologically advanced as the Allies, and the mechanisms of their radars were much simpler than those of their English counterparts. This revelation was profound. For months, the Würzburg had been a source of fear precisely because it was unknown. The RAF had suffered under its guidance and imagined it to be something extraordinary, a superweapon born of German scientific brilliance that could only be countered by equally extraordinary means. But when the casing was opened and the circuits were laid bare, the truth was simpler. The Würzburg was good. It was effective. It was killing men. But it was not magic. It was a machine, and like all machines, it had limits. Its receiver had a specific bandwidth. Its transmitter operated on a narrow range of frequencies. Its tracking method, while accurate, depended on an unbroken signal return. Interrupt that return, flood that frequency with noise, and the operator would see nothing but static. The interrogation of the captured German operator filled in the operational picture. The operator could explain the procedures, how the Würzburg was calibrated, how targets were acquired and tracked, how the data was relayed to the night fighter controller, what the operator saw on his display, what confused him, what made tracking difficult. This last category, what made tracking difficult, was the most valuable intelligence of all, because it told the British exactly where the system was weakest. The operator described situations where the radar lost track, where clutter from weather or terrain confused the return signal, where the narrow beam of the dish made it possible to lose a target that maneuvered sharply. These were not theoretical weaknesses. They were operational realities, confirmed by a man who had spent months sitting behind the display, watching British bombers appear as blips on his screen and guiding night fighters to kill them. The scientists now had what they needed: the frequency, the bandwidth, the receiver sensitivity, the tracking method, The vulnerabilities. The Würzburg had been opened like a locked box, and inside they found not a mystery, but a machine with clear, exploitable flaws. The British captured significant parts of a Würzburg Type A apparatus at Bruneval. This set was the least advanced version. However, it passed on quite some information. Even the fact that it was a Type A, the least advanced version, was valuable. It told the British that the system they had feared most was not even the best Germany could produce. More advanced versions, with wider frequency agility and improved tracking, were certainly in development. But even the basic model had given Britain the foundation it needed. The crates from Bruneval did not just deliver components. They delivered certainty. The certainty that the Würzburg could be fought, that the invisible wall over Europe had seams, that the machine which had been killing RAF crews for months could be blinded. But knowing and doing are different things. The countermeasures still had to be built, tested, debated, approved, and deployed. And that process would take far longer and prove far more politically complicated than anyone in the Bruneval raiding party could have imagined. The knowledge from Bruneval did not produce an instant weapon. It produced an argument. The components were analyzed, the frequencies were confirmed, the vulnerabilities were mapped, and the scientists at TRE, now in possession of everything they needed to design effective countermeasures, moved with urgency to translate intelligence into action. The most promising countermeasure was also the simplest. RAF Jones had suggested that a piece of metal foil falling through the air might create radar echoes. In early 1942, a TRE researcher named Joan Curran investigated the idea and came up with a scheme for dumping packets of aluminium strips from aircraft to generate a cloud of false echoes. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Cut strips of aluminium foil to a length of approximately half the wavelength of the enemy radar. Drop them from bombers in large quantities. Each strip would resonate at the radar's frequency, reflecting the signal just as an aircraft would. The radar operator's screen would fill with thousands of false returns, each one indistinguishable from a real aircraft. The bombers would vanish into a blizzard of phantom blips. Joan Curran, a Welsh physicist working with the Telecommunications Research Establishment, developed the idea of cutting aluminium strips to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies, maximizing their reflective properties. The device was codenamed Window, and it worked. In tests, it worked devastatingly well. A handful of aluminium strips, weighing almost nothing, could blind a radar that cost thousands of man-hours to build and required a trained crew to operate. But Window was not deployed. Not in 1942. Not for more than a year after its effectiveness was proven. The reason was fear. Unaware of the opposing Air Force's knowledge of the chaff concept, planners felt that using it was even more dangerous than not, since as soon as it was used, the enemy could easily duplicate it and use it against them. In particular, the British government's leading scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, pointed out that if the RAF used it against the Germans, the Luftwaffe would quickly copy it and could launch a new blitz. This caused concern in RAF Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command, who managed to suppress the use of Window until July 1943. The argument against Window was logical. If Britain dropped aluminium strips over Germany, the Germans would collect the strips from the ground within hours. They would understand immediately what they were and how they worked. They would produce their own version and drop it over England. And British radar, the same radar that had saved the country during the Battle of Britain, would be blinded just as effectively as the German sets. It was a standoff of the mind. Both sides, as it turned out, had independently discovered the principle. German scientists knew exactly what the strips were, duple, but had refrained from using them for the same reasons. For over a year, the curious situation arose where both sides of the conflict knew how to use chaff to jam the other side's radar, but had refrained from doing so for fear of their opponent replying in kind. Meanwhile, the bombers kept flying, and the bombers kept dying. The debate over window consumed months. Jones argued passionately for its deployment. Others argued with equal passion against it. The matter went back and forth between scientific advisors, air marshals, and politicians. It was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of consensus in the face of genuine uncertainty. Since there was no effective countermeasure, it was judged to be too risky to use, until Churchill eventually authorized its use on the 23rd of July, 1943. It was indeed devastatingly effective. By the summer of 1943, the balance of risk had shifted. The Luftwaffe bombing campaign against Britain had diminished. Far more, British bombers were now heading to Germany than German bombers were heading to England. Fighter Command had newer, centimetric radar sets that were less vulnerable to jamming. The risk of German retaliation with their own chaff was now judged to be manageable. Harris chose his target: Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. The first major use of window came during Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, a massive Allied bombing raid on Hamburg, Germany. On the night of the 24th of July, 791 bombers flew toward Hamburg, and as they approached the German coast, each aircraft began to drop bundles of aluminium strips through flare chutes at regular intervals. The strips tumbled through the dark sky, catching the wind, dispersing into vast clouds of metallic confetti that drifted slowly toward the earth. On the ground, the Würzburg operators watched their screens dissolve. The anti-aircraft guns fired randomly or not at all, and the night fighters, their radar displays swamped with false echoes, utterly failed to find the bomber stream. A vast area of Hamburg was devastated, with the loss of only 12 bombers. 12 out of nearly 800. A loss rate of approximately 1.5%. On a night when, without window, the losses would have been 4% or higher. The Würzburg was blind. The strips of aluminium foil cut to 27 centimeters, exactly half the wavelength of 560 megahertz, had done what months of arguments and committee meetings and scientific debates had failed to do. They had broken the system, not by destroying the radars, not by jamming them with powerful transmitters, but by exploiting the precise vulnerability that the Bruneval components had revealed. The Würzburg's receiver could not distinguish between the echo from a bomber and the echo from a strip of tin foil. The knowledge from Bruneval had made this possible. Without the confirmed frequency, the strips could not have been cut to the correct length. Without the understanding of the receiver's sensitivity, the density of the chaff drops could not have been calculated. Without the operator's testimony about what confused the display, the tactical method of deploying window could not have been optimized. But window was only the beginning. Other radar-confusing techniques included airborne jamming devices codenamed mandrel, pipe rack, jostle, and carpet. Mandrel was an airborne jammer targeted at the German Freya radars, while carpet targeted the gun-laying Würzburg radar. In specific operations, such as the USAAF's Big Week from the 20th to the 25th of February 1944, jamming halved the efficiency of German anti-aircraft defenses. Overall, Allied electronic warfare tactics diminished Würzburg detection reliability by 50 to 80% in jammed sectors, shifting the balance toward air superiority. The Würzburg had been the cornerstone of Germany's air defense. After Bruneval, it was the cornerstone of Germany's vulnerability. The same machine that had once killed with impunity now struggled to see. The same dish that had tracked bombers across the night sky now spun uselessly, its display a snowstorm of phantom echoes. The Germans adapted. They spread their operating frequencies. They developed countermeasures. The Würzburg had been designed to have as stable an operating frequency as possible, which made varying its operational frequency a rather difficult task. The very precision that had made the Würzburg deadly now made it rigid. It could not easily escape the frequency band where window was tuned to destroy it. The electronic war over Europe became a cascading cycle of measure and countermeasure. The British jammed. The Germans shifted frequencies. The British recalibrated. The Germans added filters. The British introduced new jamming techniques. The cycle continued until the end of the war, but the fundamental advantage never shifted back to the Germans. Because the British had seen inside the machine. They understood its architecture. They knew its limits. And that knowledge had been carried off a cliff in France by 120 men in the winter of 1942. The cliff at Bruneval is still there. The ravine still runs down to the beach. The sea still pushes against the shingle. The wind still blows off the channel, cold and sharp and carrying the salt of the Atlantic. If you stand on the clifftop today and look south, you can see the shape of the landscape that Frost and Cox and 118 other men saw on the night they jumped. The fields, the hedgerows, the gentle roll of the French countryside meeting the hard edge of the coast. The villa is gone. The Würzburg is gone. The enclosure where Cox worked by moonlight, pulling the guts from a German radar while bullets cracked overhead, is a patch of grass. There is a memorial plaque. There are flowers sometimes. But the ground does not explain what happened here. It never does. What happened here was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was not a struggle for territory or a clash of armies. It was a raid conducted for a single purpose: to learn. To take a machine that was killing men and bring it home, open it up and understand it, to convert fear into data, to convert mystery into engineering, to convert the unknown into the solvable. The success of the raid had two important effects. First, a successful raid against German-occupied territory was a welcome morale boost for the British public, and featured prominently in the British media for several weeks afterwards. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, took a personal interest in the operation and on the 3rd of March assembled the War Cabinet to hear from Frost and several other officers who had participated in it. The public saw a daring raid. The newspapers celebrated bravery. The politicians noted the morale value. But the real consequences were invisible. They played out in laboratories and jamming transmitters and bundles of aluminium foil tumbling through the night sky over Hamburg, over the Ruhr, over Berlin. The success of the raid prompted the War Office to expand the existing British Airborne Forces, setting up the Airborne Forces Depot and Battle School in Derbyshire in April 1942, and creating the Parachute Regiment. Frost would go on to lead those paratroopers in some of the most famous operations of the war. At Arnhem, 2.5 years later, he would hold a bridge against impossible odds, and the same quiet determination he had shown at Bruneval would sustain him through days of fighting that would become legend. But that is another story. This story is about the night the machine stopped being mysterious. The Würzburg had ruled the skies over Europe. It had tracked bombers with a precision that felt like omniscience. It had fed data to night fighters that arrived in the dark, like assassins, guided by an electronic hand that seemed impossible to evade. For the crews of Bomber Command, the Würzburg was not a radar. It was a presence, an invisible authority that could reach up into the sky and pluck them from existence. And then 120 men jumped into the snow on a French cliff, fought their way to the machine, took it apart, carried it down to the sea, and brought it home. What the scientists found inside was not a superweapon. It was a system. A well-designed, carefully built, effectively deployed system that operated within specific parameters and had specific weaknesses. When those weaknesses were identified, they were exploited. When they were exploited, the system failed. The principle is always the same. Technology is most powerful when it is unknown. A weapon that your enemy cannot understand is a weapon that your enemy cannot fight. But the moment the casing is opened, the moment the frequency is measured, the moment the circuit is traced, the mystery dissolves. What remains is engineering, and engineering can be countered. The Würzburg did not disappear after Bruneval. It continued to operate in modified forms until the end of the war. After the Second World War, the Würzburg Riese was used in astronomical research. Dutch scientists brought some of the coastal radar systems to the Netherlands and used them in early radio astronomy to help discover the hydrogen line and map the spiral arms of the Milky Way. There is something quietly fitting about that. A machine built to find bombers in the dark, repurposed to find galaxies. A weapon of war, converted into an instrument of knowledge. The same parabolic dish that had tracked Lancasters over France was pointed upward, into the void, and used to listen to the whisper of hydrogen across the cosmos. The men who jumped at Bruneval did not know any of this. They did not know that the components they stripped from the cliff would accelerate the electronic warfare that reshaped the air war. They did not know that the intelligence they gathered would contribute to the blinding of the Kammhuber line, to the success of the 1,000 bomber raids, to the gradual erosion of German air superiority that made the invasion of Normandy possible. They knew only what soldiers know, that the job was in front of them, that the clock was running, that the boat was waiting or not waiting, that the snow was cold and the bullets were real and the machine on the cliff had to be taken apart before dawn. Cox did not receive wide public recognition. He returned to his duties with the quiet that characterized technical men of his generation. On the 15th of May, 1942, a special supplement to the London Gazette carried the announcement of 19 decorations. Frost was awarded the Military Cross, Cook the Distinguished Service Cross, and Cox the Military Medal. Jones received a CBE. The sappers and paratroopers received their mentions and their medals and went back to training for the next operation. The war continued. The electronic war intensified. The measure and countermeasure cycle that Bruneval had triggered would spiral through 1943 and 44, growing more complex with each passing month. Jamming, counter-jamming, window, duple, carpet, mandrel, an invisible war fought with radio waves and aluminium strips and oscilloscope screens, all of it rooted in the night 120 men landed on a cliff and took a machine apart. The cliff is quiet now. The wind still blows. The channel is still gray and cold and wide. The radar is gone, carried home in crates, its secrets long since extracted and its purpose long since obsolete. But the lesson remains, as sharp as it was on that February night in 1942. The real weapon is not the machine. The real weapon is understanding it. The moment an empire's most feared technology stops being mysterious and becomes solvable, the balance shifts. Not with a crash, not with a declaration, but with a quiet certainty that spreads through laboratories and briefing rooms and the cockpits of bombers flying south through the dark. On the night of the 27th of February 1942, Britain stole a machine and discovered something unusual. The machine that ruled the sky had limits, and limits can be broken.